I went to my wife's dinner with her lover and said, "So this was your secret all along?" She was desperate when she saw me show up unexpectedly. Her hands trembled, her eyes searched for a place to hide her guilt, but there was nowhere left to hide. Amidst expensive glasses and plates, our marriage ended. Not with shouts or scandals. It ended with the silence of disappointment. It ended with a look from me that she no longer recognized. I stood up with the weight of years shared, left behind the ring I had once proudly worn, and walked away without looking back. She tried to explain it to me later, of course she did. But her lover, he had already made it clear he wanted nothing more to do with her. And in that moment, alone in the echo of what she had destroyed with her own hands, she faced the emptiness of what she had lost. I, after a while, found a new love. With a light smile, a complete presence, and loyalty that requires no vigilance. Months later, she came to me in tears, but all I heard was, I was wrong. I had already forgiven her. Not to start over with her, but to move on in peace. We closed the door respectfully. She was left with the longing. I, with the serenity of someone who has learned to love herself again. But that's what everyone thinks they know. What no one tells is what it was like to live every second of it. No one imagines the bitter taste of holding a fork, feigning calm when the blood inside boils with humiliation. No one understands the kind of silence that settles between two bodies who sleep together but no longer share their souls. Dinner was just the final straw. The poison began long before, in small, imperceptible doses. And the worst part is that when you love, you blind yourself with pleasure, because it hurts less to believe the lie than to face the truth. But the truth, sooner or later, always finds a way to break down the door of your house. She lied with a naturalness that made me doubt my sanity. She kissed me with a mouth that whispered to someone else. And yet, I loved her. In a way that hurt, but I loved her. I took care of her when she was sick, made her coffee just the way she liked it, complimented her when she changed her haircut. I was there. Present. Whole. And that was precisely what she no longer saw. I was no longer a novelty. I was the comfort she grew tired of feeling. And no matter how hard I tried, she was already elsewhere. The body beside me was just the shell of a broken promise. I remember the first day I suspected her. She left smelling more fragrant than usual, with a smile that wasn't meant for me. She said she was meeting a friend from college, but she didn't bring the large bag she always carried her books with her. When she returned, she was cold. She kissed me on the cheek like someone kissing a distant uncle. The next day, he brought me a gift, as if trying to buy my silence. And I accepted, like someone who wants to believe it's all just paranoia. The betrayal didn't begin with the kiss, it began with the disinterest. With the face-down cell phone. With the, "I don't have time right now," that repeated itself every night. With the dinners where she'd check her phone and smile at the screen, but not at me. With the touch that became rare. With the hug that became protocol. With the sex that became silence. And yet, I refused to see it. Because loving someone is like that, sometimes, accepting crumbs thinking they're a feast. Until one day I followed her. Not because I wanted to, but because my heart was no longer giving me peace. I saw her enter a fancy restaurant, dressed up like she hadn't dressed up for me in ages. And then he arrived. Young, confident, the kind of man who looks at the world as if he already has it all. She smiled. A smile I hadn't seen in months. She laughed lightly. She tossed her hair to the side. And I was across the street, watching it all like a movie where I was the invisible villain. I, the betrayed husband, the romantic clown. I remember my hands shaking. But I didn't go in. I went back home and remained silent. I planned. Not an attack. I planned my last act of love, letting her see with her own eyes who she'd lost. The following week, I organized the dinner. I knew where they would be. I knew from a detail she'd let slip, like someone hoping to be discovered. She'd underestimated the man she loved. And there, in the restaurant, amidst false laughter and low lighting, I appeared. The table fell silent. Her lover, embarrassed, tried to maintain his composure. She paled. I simply sat down. And I said, as if opening the gates of hell, so that was your secret all along. The rest was silence. Silence and shame. She stammered, tried to explain herself. She said it was complicated, that I didn't understand. But there was no other explanation that would fit on that table. I just got up, took off my ring, and left it on the tablecloth. There was no need to scream. The pain spoke for me. After that, she sought me out. She cried. She sent messages. She wrote letters. She tried to win me back. And me? I wanted to hate her. But all I could feel was exhaustion. A weariness so deep that not even love could resist it. So I forgave. Not for her. But for myself. I forgave to free myself. The months passed. And life, which is wise, brought a new story. A serene love. Someone who needed no surprises, just presence. Who told me where he was, without me asking. Who smiled with his eyes. And I learned to breathe again. I learned to sleep without fear of waking up alone next to someone. I learned that loyalty shouldn't be begged for. But life also has a cruel way of teaching. One day, she wrote me a long letter, full of regrets. She said she felt empty. That no one looked at her the way I did anymore. That she no longer had genuine laughter. That her lover never wanted anything serious, and that when she tried to return, he had already disappeared. She said she started rereading the books I left on the shelf, and inside one of them she found something. A small note, in my handwriting. It said, "You are my home, even when the whole world falls apart." And she cried. She cried like she had never cried before. She cried because she realized she had had everything. And traded it for nothing. Now, she lives with longing. I, with peace. And yet, there's still something she doesn't know. A detail, hidden in that dinner. Something no one noticed that night everything fell apart. Something that changed the course of everything, even before my goodbye. Because sometimes, the greatest betrayal isn't what she did to me, it's what she did to herself. And that's why, to this day, she returns to that restaurant. Alone. Sitting at the same table. Waiting for time to return. But time doesn't return. And that note she found, that note wasn't there by chance. Because sometimes, love leaves traps where there seemed to be hope. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize and never support any form of betrayal. All the stories told are fiction, but are born from the cruel truth that betrayal destroys homes, feelings, and entire lives. Our purpose is clear: show the real consequences of wrong choices and value true love. Get ready to dive into a story shocking, intense and unforgettable. Press play. The truth hurts. But it needs to be told. They met on a cloudy October afternoon, as if even the weather knew that their encounter would mark the beginning of something as intense as it was unpredictable. She came from a troubled past, a youth marked by uncertainty and unstable relationships, and even with her firm, independent demeanor, there was something in her gaze that always betrayed a certain restlessness, a latent desire to find something solid, something that would make her feel, finally, like she belonged. He, on the other hand, carried an almost uneasy calm, a natural serenity of someone who never rushed anything, but also of someone who always sought depth in everything. He was the kind of man who paid attention to silences, who saw nuances in words, who knew how to listen even when nothing was said. Their encounter wasn't explosive, but it carried weight, it had roots. It began with a simple conversation, a restrained exchange of glances, and ended, weeks later, with two bodies lying side by side, peaceful, as if they had finally reached someplace safe. Over time, they built a life that seemed exemplary to many. Their downtown apartment was small, but it had just the right amount of light streaming through the windows. Mornings began with strong coffee and distracted kisses. On Saturdays, they cooked together and laughed at inside jokes that only made sense between them. They had their own rituals, like the one where she left notes in his wallet before work trips, or when he drew her long baths on days when the world seemed too much. It wasn't a superficial relationship. It was real. There were fights, of course, like every couple. Some were harsh, silent. But at the end of the day, there was always reconciliation. Not because they ignored their problems, but because they chose, every day, to remain on the same side. It was this daily choice that shaped the first years of their marriage, a solid foundation made of small, consistent decisions, a kind of love that develops in routine, strengthened by small loyalties. She always had ambition. Not necessarily in the material sense, but a thirst for more experiences, more intensity, more stories to live. She liked to move the furniture around, even when he thought everything was already perfect. She had a restless mind, a constant need to renew what seemed stable. He saw this with admiration, finding beautiful the way she reinvented herself, how she refused to stagnate. But at the same time, this constant movement made her look ahead with a frequency that sometimes prevented her from seeing what already existed alongside her. He, on the other hand, was stable by nature. Not for lack of dreams, but for gratitude. He believed that happiness was more about constancy than euphoria. While she gazed at the horizon, he clung to his roots. And for a long time, this difference was complementary. While she pulled toward the new, he anchored her. While he paused for breath, she pushed him forward. Their lives continued like this for years, maturing through small achievements and big decisions. They bought a car, traveled to Europe, and adopted a dog that became the centerpiece of their home. In the eyes of their friends, they were the ideal couple, balanced, sincere, and complicit. They constantly received praise for the visible connection between them. She often said he was her safe haven. He, in turn, told everyone that she made him feel alive. There was a mutual admiration that remained evident even in the simplest gestures. When they were together, time seemed to slow down. They didn't need much, all they needed was a couch, a cheap bottle of wine, and honest conversation. And that was what strengthened them. This ability to make the ordinary special. But real life isn't about photogenic moments. Little by little, the noises began to grow. At first, almost imperceptible, a delay that would once have been communicated with a phone call now became just a dry message. A conversation interrupted by the distraction of a cell phone. A dwindling interest in the day's stories. She began to mentally withdraw from conversations, and he began to keep more to himself than share. There was no sudden crisis. There was no scream from the middle of the room. The distance between them grew almost imperceptibly, like a silk thread slowly stretching until it threatened to snap. There was still love, but it was accompanied by frustration. There was still care, but now it arose amidst small resentments. She began to feel misunderstood. He, unappreciated. And what had once been balance now began to feel like opposition. What had been a compliment became a burden. Even so, they both tried. They had dinners together, organized short trips, and dug up old photos in search of memories of what had brought them together. They talked about couples therapy, about changing their surroundings, changing their routines, changing their habits. She suggested they dedicate themselves to a project together. He proposed they spend more time away from social media. Neither proposal lasted long. There was always something that pushed them back into stagnation. Their relationship was now marked more by tentativeness than continuity. But even so, when they looked into each other's eyes, there was affection. There was still that old recognition, almost like two old friends sharing a silent secret. Work began to take up more space. She began traveling more. Conferences, events, meetings. She returned tired, distracted, often with her mind already elsewhere. He respected and admired her dedication, but he missed her presence. Not physically, but emotionally. Sometimes, even when she was home, it felt like she was miles away. He spent most of his days trying to maintain a balanced routine, taking care of the house, the dog, the bills. And on weekends, he did everything he could to please her. He made her breakfast in bed, rented her favorite movies, suggested restaurants. But increasingly, she seemed less moved by his gestures. Her gaze was dull, as if searching for something she couldn't yet name. Inside, she was living a conflict. She wasn't unhappy. But she wasn't completely happy either. She felt torn between the stability she'd built and a restlessness she couldn't explain. It was as if something inside her was crying out for movement, intensity, emotion. As if the comfort of the relationship was no longer enough. She never stopped admiring her husband. But he began to feel there was no longer room for growth there. As if what once united them was slowly becoming a wall between them. The love still existed, but it was like an old song you love but no longer hear with the same impact. And even though he tries to repeat the chorus, it no longer evokes the same feelings. The relationship remains suspended between the memory of what had been and the fear of what could become. And this emotional limbo became the new normal. They didn't fight. But they weren't enchanted either. They slept in the same bed, but dreams were no longer shared. Each began to live in their own bubble of silence, disguised by a routine that seemed functional. To the outside, they remained the same couple as always. But inside, they both knew something had been lost, and neither knew exactly when or how. It was in this scenario that the story began to take a new direction. Small choices, seemingly harmless gestures, words spoken at the wrong time, everything began to pave the way for a breakup. There was no betrayal yet, but there was a screaming absence. A void filled by distractions, excuses, silences. And it's precisely there that the story gains momentum, when the two, without realizing it, begin to drift apart, not out of lack of love, but out of exhaustion trying to reclaim something that was already out of reach. She started going out more alone. Dinners with friends, after-work happy hours, cultural events. She said she needed to breathe. That she needed space. He, on the other hand, retreated into himself. He started going out less, reading more, finding in books a way to not feel so invisible. He kept his longing, his discomfort, his thoughts to himself. And so, while she looked outward, he lost himself inward. They still slept side by side. They still shared tasks. But the previous warmth had transformed into a warm, steady, bearable breeze. And that's what hurts the most, when the pain comes not like a storm, but like a never-ending drizzle. On the surface, everything seemed the same. But inside each of them, something had already changed forever. And it was only a matter of time before this change revealed itself in the form of a decision. There were no words yet, but their hearts were already screaming truths their mouths couldn't muster. And in this silent phase, this phase of invisible separation, lies the root of what would come to pass. Because no story ends suddenly. It just begins to die slowly. And when it finally explodes, it's not because of what happened that day, it's because of everything that's been ignored up until that point. He began to notice the signs in the subtlest details, in the moments when her silence seemed to weigh more heavily than any spoken word. The absence ceased to be physical and became a disconnected presence, as if her body were there, but her mind wandered to places he couldn't reach. Their eyes no longer met as often, and when they did, there was an almost automatic averting of gaze, as if someone avoided looking for fear of betraying a hidden thought. Kisses became mechanical gestures, hugs, empty promises. Conversations, once long and lively, were now limited to the necessary. All of this consumed him silently, and he said nothing. Not because he didn't feel it, but because there was still hope, a stubborn hope that it was just a phase, that perhaps she was going through something she hadn't yet dared to share. She, in turn, lived a constant internal conflict. There were moments when she felt guilty just for thinking what she was thinking. She questioned her feelings, tried to remember what had once made her love that man, forced herself to find traces of the past that had brought them together in the present. But the more she tried, the more she lost herself. The routine suffocated her, the repetitions killed the charm. The stability that had once been the foundation of their love was now what made her feel trapped. And when she finally met someone else, someone who made her laugh effortlessly, who looked at her with desire, who listened to her with renewed attention, she felt alive again. At first, she thought it was just admiration, perhaps a simple emotional distraction. But when she realized she longed for his messages, that she counted the days until their casual encounters in the middle of work, she understood that her feelings went beyond that. And even knowing what was at stake, he didn't back down. The truth is, she hadn't planned to cheat. It just happened. And when it happened, she didn't just feel guilt, she felt a dangerous relief, as if she were breathing after years of being underwater. The encounters with the other man began discreetly. A coffee after work, an excuse for some commitment, a late afternoon in a neighborhood where no one knew them. She always returned home feeling lighter, as if she'd shed the weight of a monotonous life. And he, waiting for her, noticed the difference. He thought perhaps she was getting better about something she'd never confessed. He felt relieved to see her smiling again, even if he didn't know why. He believed that perhaps the distance between them was beginning to close. And that made him give of himself even more. He began planning a new trip, considered proposing a course they could take together, something that would rekindle the bond that seemed to be slowly unraveling. He wanted to win her back. Not out of desperation, but out of love. He still loved her deeply, and that's why he accepted crumbs, thinking they were gestures of return. One night, she arrived home later than usual. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup slightly smudged, her gaze wandering. He was waiting for her with the table set, an open bottle of wine, and a lasagna he'd spent the entire afternoon preparing. When she entered, surprised by the scene, she smiled guiltlessly. She sat down, ate in silence, and complimented the food with a short sentence, but it was enough for him to cling to the illusion that there was still a us there. They spent the night together, he trying to touch her skin with the memory of what they once were, she pretending to feel something she could no longer find within herself. When she fell asleep, she turned to the opposite side, and he lay there, eyes open in the darkness, sensing something was terribly wrong but lacking the courage to confirm it. The days that followed were full of contradictions. She spent more time in the bathroom, changed clothes more than once before going out, spent more time on her cell phone. He noticed everything, but preferred silence. Not out of cowardice, but because the fear of confirmation was greater than the anguish of doubt. Until one day, while accidentally rummaging through her drawer looking for a charger, he found a perfume he didn't recognize. It was a masculine, intense fragrance. And no matter how much he tried to rationalize, his heart already knew. It was like being hit by an invisible punch, an internal collapse. He said nothing at the time. He put the bottle back in the same place, closed the drawer, and took a deep breath. He needed to be sure. He needed to see it with his own eyes. In the following days, he began to observe her differently. He noticed the haste with which she responded to some messages, the care with which she dressed for ordinary outings, the way she avoided letting him touch her cell phone. He wasn't a suspicious man by nature, but now her every gesture seemed to scream a cry for help. A plea she didn't have the courage to voice out loud. And that was when he decided to follow his instincts. He waited for a day when she said she had a meeting out of town, something quick, just for an afternoon. He said he'd sleep at her friend's house to avoid traffic on the way back. He smiled, wished her a safe trip, and a few hours later, he got in the car and drove to the address she'd mentioned. Upon arriving there, he discovered there was no meeting. No event. No friend. Just a vacation rental, one of those modern lofts with a glass balcony overlooking the avenue. He parked far away and watched from inside the car. Hours passed until the door opened. And then she appeared, accompanied. The two of them laughed, embraced, as if they shared a delicious secret. He couldn't see anything else. Not because he looked away, but because his eyes filled with tears and everything blurred. He returned home in silence. He didn't break anything, didn't yell, didn't call to confront her. He no longer needed explanations. He knew that, from then on, what remained was no longer a marriage. It was morning. He spent the night awake, lying in the bed that had been theirs for so long, listening to the ticking of the clock and thinking about every moment, every gesture, every glance she had looked away from. The whole time, she was no longer there. He simply didn't want to see it. The next day, she returned. She arrived smiling, saying the trip had been tiring, that she just wanted a shower and to sleep. He simply nodded, as if signing a certificate of completion. He watched as she showered, put on her pajamas, and lay down beside him. And there, in that suffocating silence, he knew there was nothing more to say. But still, he did nothing. He didn't tell her he knew. He didn't confront her. She wanted her to confess. She wanted her to look him in the eye and have the courage to admit it. Because for him, there was still a spark of respect left. A need for the truth, at least in the end, to no longer be denied. In the following days, he acted normally. He made coffee, asked how the day was, smiled with his lips but never with his eyes. Meanwhile, she sank deeper and deeper into lies. She created flimsy alibis, disjointed stories. He listened to everything in silence, like someone watching a play and already knowing the ending. It was then that he decided to plan his final act. He learned from a mutual friend that she would be at a special dinner, a work event with select guests. He knew the other man would be there. And it was at this dinner that he decided to end it all. He dressed elegantly, as he had done when they went out together. He arrived at the restaurant first, observed from afar, and waited for the right moment. When she entered with her lover, walking beside him as if he were the only man in the world, he felt everything at once, anger, pain, pity. But also relief. Because finally, everything was out in the open. Their table was in the corner, near the window. They were laughing, toasting. He walked toward the table calmly, as if in control of his own destiny. When she saw him, the glass nearly fell from her hands. Her lover was speechless. He simply looked at them both, then back at her, and said quietly but firmly, "So that was your secret all along?" The silence that followed was louder than any scream. She tried to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. Her lover stood up, uncomfortable, as if he didn't want to be part of the scene. And he, the betrayed man, simply left the ring he'd worn for years on the table, looked into her eyes once more, and left. He didn't need anything else. She already knew. But what she didn't yet know, what neither of them knew, was that there was something hidden behind that night. A detail that would change everything. A secret he had discovered but hadn't yet revealed. Something that would make what seemed painful become unforgivable. And that revelation was yet to come. She spent the days following dinner like someone walking through rubble, trying to pick up the pieces of something she already knew deep down was destroyed. His gaze as he spoke those words was more cutting than any confrontation, more definitive than any argument. And it wasn't his presence there that shocked her. It was the absence of anger. It was the silence filled with contempt, as if he were no longer trying to understand or save anything. As if he'd left her there, surrendered to her own emptiness. Her lover, for his part, barely waited for the car to arrive. He hurried out, saying he couldn't get involved in that kind of drama, that she needed to sort out her own life, that he'd never promised her anything but good times. And when the car drove off with him inside, leaving her alone in the middle of the sidewalk, in an expensive dress, her eyes blurred with makeup and regret, she knew she was truly alone. For the first time in years, she had neither the comfort of lies nor the support of another. She was alone with herself, and with the unbearable weight of the choices she'd made. She tried. She texted, called, wrote a long email, almost begging to be heard. And, to her surprise, he responded, arranging to meet at a park they used to frequent in the early years of their relationship. He arrived punctually, wearing a simple shirt but the same perfume as always. His face no longer bore the pain, but neither showed any desire for reconciliation. She sat hesitantly beside him, and for a few minutes neither of them said anything. Only the wind through the trees spoke. Until, with a trembling voice, she said she wanted to apologize. She said she didn't know how she had gotten there, that she wasn't the person she wanted to be, that she still loved him in a way she couldn't even explain. He simply looked ahead, took a deep breath, and in a calm voice, replied that he had known everything long before that night. She frowned in confusion, and he continued, explaining that he had discovered the affair months before, that he had chosen to observe in silence because he wanted to see how far she would go, if she would have the courage to speak, if there was still something true inside her. Shocked, she questioned why he hadn't confronted her sooner, why he'd waited so long. And it was then that he turned his face toward her and, with firm eyes, revealed what she'd least expected to hear. He said that, weeks before dinner, he'd stumbled upon a small cardboard box among her books. He thought it was some old memento, perhaps something work-related. But when he opened it, he found about a dozen notes, all written by himself, in the early years of their marriage. Notes he'd hidden inside her books, with love phrases, short poems, wishes, memories. She'd never commented on any of them. He'd always thought she'd lost them, or even noticed. But there they all were. Carefully folded, kept as if they were small, forgotten treasures. And beside them, a torn piece of paper, with words handwritten by her, from a moment he'd never known existed. She fell silent, frozen, not understanding where this was leading her. He then took a piece of paper, visibly old, from his wallet and read softly, "If I ever forget what he means to me, may these notes remind me. He loves me like no one else has ever loved. And I, even without knowing how to repay all this, hope I never lose the right to deserve that love." Silence fell between them like a thunderclap. She brought her hands to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. This was hers. She'd written it one day, in a fit of guilt or perhaps lucidity. She couldn't remember exactly when, but she remembered doing it. She didn't know he'd found it. She didn't know he'd read it. He then rose from the bench, calmly straightening his shirt, and said that that note had been the last ray of hope he held within himself. That for days he tried to believe that, upon meeting her, she would remember everything they had been. But what he saw, day after day, was her drifting further and further away, ignoring even the truth itself. He said his forgiveness had already been delivered. But not as she had expected. It wasn't the kind of forgiveness that reopens doors. It was the kind that locks them shut. The kind that respectfully seals a story that had no further potential. She then burst into tears, saying she still loved him, that she'd lost herself, that she'd made a terrible mistake, but that there could still be a new beginning. He lowered his eyes, took a deep breath, and for the first time since dinner, his voice wavered. He said the betrayal hadn't been the worst part. The worst part was that she'd lost her own essence. That she'd let go of what made her special. He said the love between them was real, rare, but that love doesn't survive where there's no truth. And that he, as much as he'd loved her with everything he had, could no longer sacrifice himself for someone who chose not to listen to their own heart. She tried to touch him, but he recoiled. He said he had to go. But before he left, he told her he'd left an envelope for her at home with all his old notes. He told her she could throw them away, tear them up, burn them, do whatever she wanted. But if she dared, she should reread them. Not for him, but for herself. To remember who she was before she lost herself. Hours later, she arrived home and saw the envelope on the table. She sat alone, lit a candle, perhaps seeking a ritual that would bring some purification. And, one by one, she read the notes. Every line, every letter. She cried like never before. Not because of the end of her marriage, but because of the brutal realization of what she had destroyed. Those papers, so simple, carried all the love she had ever known but failed to appreciate. And when she reached the last note, she found another surprise. A clipping from a photograph of the two of them, taken early in their relationship, and behind it, a phrase he had written himself in black pen: "Love only survives where there is presence. You were absent." That night, she slept on the couch, the envelope in her lap, her eyes swollen from crying. And it was there, alone, that she understood that the real secret wasn't the betrayal. The real secret was how much he loved her silently, even as she silently destroyed him. That man knew, silently, that he was losing the woman he loved, and yet he waited. He waited for her to return on her own. He waited for a gesture, a sign, a return. And when he realized it wasn't coming, he decided to leave. Not out of anger, but out of dignity. And what she never expected happened days later. Amidst the emptiness, trying to rebuild something from her own broken pieces, she discovered that he had not only moved on, but had found love again. Not a substitute, not a distraction, but someone who looked at him with the same depth he always offered. Someone who read his notes and responded with others. Who laughed at his jokes. Who saw the value she herself had ignored. And it was in that moment that the guilt turned into true regret. Because it was no longer just the pain of loss. It was the knowledge that she had lost something she would never have again. But all of this was just the beginning. Because what she didn't know was that this new love didn't just happen. It came after something he discovered, something she'd hidden, and that would forever change the meaning of that betrayal. Something that not even she was prepared to face. And it was about to come to light. Days after that encounter in the park, she began to live in a state of waiting. She waited for a message, a gesture, any word that might be the opening through which to begin anew. But nothing came. His absence was definitive, cutting, without bridges. She was still trying to convince herself that she could rebuild something, even if she didn't know exactly how. She began seeking advice from friends, attending solitary gatherings in places they frequented together, revisiting the same supermarket aisles as if trying, in a ritual, to summon the presence of something that was no longer there. She began visiting her own parents more often, trying to find in them the calm she had lost. But her mother, looking at her with teary eyes, said nothing but a single sentence, which would hammer in her head for days: "You forgot what you held in your hands." And it was true. She had forgotten. Not out of malice, but out of carelessness. And now all that remained was the echo of what could no longer be touched. But then, weeks later, he agreed to see her again. Not to return, not to reopen wounds. But because there was still one last conversation. An emotional reckoning that needed to happen. They arranged to meet in a new place, far from their old surroundings, as if understanding that certain ruins don't deserve to be revisited. It was a small corner cafe, hidden among trees and old buildings. She arrived first, nervous, fiddling with her rings, checking the door every 2 seconds. When he arrived, he was wearing a jacket she didn't recognize. He was different. Lighter. But it wasn't the kind of happy lightness, it was the lightness of someone who'd let go of a burden. She smiled shyly, and he sat down without returning her smile. She began by talking about what she'd said before, that she'd made a mistake, that she regretted it, that she still loved him. But there was less insistence now, more resignation. And perhaps that's why he decided to speak, to open up what he'd kept hidden until then. He said there was something she needed to know. Something that wouldn't change the past, but that might explain the exact point where everything had broken. She nodded silently. And then he pulled a printed sheet from his pocket. It was a screenshot of a conversation from months ago. Not between her and her lover. But between her lover and someone else. A mutual acquaintance, who had sent it to him by chance, unaware of the context. And there, in those exchanged words, lay an unbearable truth. In the conversation, her lover said he felt nothing for her, that he considered her needy, easy to manipulate, and that he was only with her for fun. He said, in cold, objective words, that she talked too much about her husband, that she was always saying how incredible and devoted he was, and that this bored him. She has a husband who idolizes her, but wants to feel like she can still be desired by someone else. I just take advantage of the opportunity, read one of the messages. Reading it for the first time weeks earlier, he had a reaction he'd never shared with anyone. He didn't feel anger toward the other man. He felt shame for her. He felt the deep embarrassment of realizing she'd given her heart, body, and trust to someone who mocked her behind her back. And that was when something inside him died for good. Because forgiving a physical betrayal was difficult, but possible. But forgiving the surrender of her intimacy to someone who despised her, it was unforgivable. She took the paper with trembling hands, read slowly, and as the sentences sank in, her expression changed. It went from denial to shock, from shock to pain, from pain to a silent, choked cry that came from a deep place. She tried to stammer something, to deny it, to say she didn't know, that she'd never imagined. But he just shook his head. He said he didn't expect excuses, that there was no more room for that. That her betrayal hurt, but the way she was treated by the other man made him lose even his compassion. He said he tried to see her as a victim, but he couldn't. Because she herself chose to throw herself into something that diminished her. And the most tragic thing was that he now saw how much she had devalued herself because of an empty need for affirmation. It wasn't about a lack of love, it was about a lack of self-respect. She said she felt like an idiot, that she didn't know how to fix it. And he replied that, indeed, he didn't know if she was an idiot. But that she was certainly a coward. A coward for not looking in the mirror before crossing a line of no return. For not remembering who he was. For not respecting their history, even after everything. She begged for forgiveness again, crying, saying she didn't know what to do with the guilt. And he, calmer than ever, said she would have to learn to live with it. That the guilt wasn't a punishment, but a reminder. And that her biggest challenge now wasn't winning someone back. It was regaining her own dignity. The coffee ended there. She sat for a while, staring at the street, her hands clutching the paper tightly, as if she could erase what was written with it. But she couldn't. And the worst part was that somewhere she knew it was all true. That she had been used. And that she had lost what she loved most to someone who didn't even respect her. When he left, he didn't look back. He walked to the end of the street, got in his car, and drove aimlessly for hours. I needed to process everything. Not because he still wanted answers, but because a different kind of love still lingered in his heart, love for himself. And it was this love that led him, a few months later, to make room for someone new. Someone who didn't bring empty promises, but a real presence. Someone who wasn't a replacement, but a reconstruction. She was calm without being boring, intense without being invasive. She was the kind of woman who, seeing him quiet, asked how he felt, and not just what he wanted for dinner. And he, who had so often been invisible, began to be truly looked at. And that was what, without saying anything, he had always wanted. She learned of the new relationship through mutual friends. She saw discreet photos on social media, heard stories during casual encounters. He felt a tightness in his chest that he couldn't name. It wasn't just jealousy. It was genuine grief for someone who still breathed, but was no longer hers. And when she saw him in person, weeks later, in a bookstore, accompanied by his new wife, she couldn't hide her surprise. He smiled, polite but distant. The woman beside him extended her hand, with genuine sympathy. And in that touch, she felt everything. She felt that there was what she had lost. And what she would never have again. That night, he returned home and opened a folder of old documents. He found the lease for their first apartment, yellowed photos, old letters. But what devastated her most was finding a small notebook where she had begun writing, early in their marriage, the things she loved about him. It was incomplete. It didn't go past page 10. She had stopped recording. Stopped remembering. Stopped feeling. And when the last blank page touched her fingers, she understood it was symbolic. That story had stopped there, too. On the page where she had given up writing. Their love didn't die for lack of passion. It died for lack of care. For choices that seemed small but turned into abysses. For words left unsaid, for gestures ignored, for needs misunderstood. And, above all, for a mistake that could never be undone. Not just the betrayal, but the choice to place their own worth in the wrong hands. Now, she carries the longing. But he carries the peace of someone who, after losing everything, found himself. And that, in the end, is what no one can take away. During the weeks that followed that last conversation, she began to realize that time was not a reliable anesthetic. Contrary to what they say, it didn't heal, it only reorganized the pains within her. In the first few days, she felt as if she'd lost her footing, then as if she were slowly sinking into quicksand. Memories returned without asking permission, an old laugh, his scent on the pillow she hadn't yet had the courage to wash, the way he'd run his fingers through his hair when he was nervous. Small images appeared out of nowhere, and each one was accompanied by a sharp pang of regret. Not the kind of performative regret you say to ask for forgiveness, but the kind that corrodes you from within, that makes you question who you've become to destroy something so rare, so yours. She had failed him, but before that, she had failed herself. And now, all that remained was the daily confrontation with the woman she refused to see in the mirror. The new woman in his life wasn't the focus of his pain, but rather living proof that he could be loved again, and fairly. She didn't feel anger, there was no room for it. She felt a kind of silent shame, knowing that someone now experienced the version of him she herself had devalued. She thought about it when she saw them together by chance, when she received inevitable news through acquaintances, when she heard his name in banal contexts and felt her heart race, even without reason. The memories now didn't come with a pleasant longing, but with a suffocating mixture of guilt and helplessness. There was nothing left to do, and this was the dilemma that destroyed her most. No matter how much she wanted to fix it, what was broken wasn't visible, it was trust, it was admiration, it was his self-esteem, and none of that could be fixed with apologies. She tried, in vain, to restart her life. She enrolled in a course, met new people, allowed herself brief encounters, but they all hit the same barrier: she couldn't give herself to anything without comparison. Everything seemed smaller, more superficial, more empty. It was as if she'd been given a very high emotional bar with that relationship, and now no one could reach it. This didn't mean she idealized it, quite the opposite. She knew every flaw, every distance, every hardship they'd faced. But it was precisely because she'd known love in its rawest and most genuine form that everything else now seemed lukewarm. And when she tried to explain this to someone, the conversation died in embarrassment. There were no words to justify losing someone who loved you so much. People just looked with disguised pity or changed the subject. And this only made her sink deeper into the loneliness of her own conscience. He, in turn, moved forward with the serenity of someone who has hit rock bottom and learned to walk again. He carried no resentment. He had left behind the weight of indignation, and perhaps that was his greatest triumph. He moved forward with ease, without harboring revenge, without seeking approval. He simply was. And this lightness, now reflected in the way he spoke, dressed, and behaved, was what most caught the attention of those who knew him before. He wasn't a new man, he was himself, but without the weight of an unbalanced relationship. And this, little by little, attracted other connections, healthier friendships, opportunities previously neglected. Life was blossoming around him, and the root of this rebirth wasn't a new woman, it was himself. The new relationship that emerged was a consequence, not a cause. And perhaps that's why it was so solid. Yet, even with all this, there were times when he found himself looking back. Not with longing, but with reflection. He remembered the time when he would do everything to please someone who no longer saw him. He thought of the silences he swallowed, the nights he embraced a distant body, the times he was ignored in his own home. He held no grudges, but still, these thoughts came like silent ghosts, reminding him that love is not enough when it's one-sided. And this memory was a shield. A reminder that he should never settle for less than he deserved. The current relationship was healthy, transparent, built on real conversations and constant presence. And he learned, little by little, that he no longer needed to fight to be seen, because now he was watched attentively by someone who didn't force him to prove his worth. Meanwhile, she began to write. Not because she wanted to transform her pain into art, but because she no longer knew how to deal with everything she felt. She bought a hardcover, unlined notebook, and into it she poured loose sentences, fragments of memories, disjointed thoughts. She wrote about how she missed being touched with love, about the regret that came in the silent dawns, about the dreams she had with him, where they would meet in simple situations, shopping, washing the dishes, laughing about something only they understood. She wrote about how her body still remembered his touch, not in the physical sense, but in the way he made her feel safe. And as she wrote, little by little, she began to understand that the grief she was experiencing wasn't just about the end of her marriage, but about the version of herself that existed in that relationship. Because deep down, she too had lost herself. By cheating, by hiding, by lying. She hadn't just betrayed him, she had betrayed the woman she wanted to be. And now, she no longer knew how to find her again. It was an ordinary afternoon that she saw him again. He was with his new partner, in a park, sitting on the grass, sharing a thermos of coffee. They were laughing about something silly, and he touched her face naturally, as he used to. But what devastated her wasn't the scene itself, it was the fact that he seemed at peace. It was a free, carefree laugh, without the weight he'd carried on his shoulders during their last days together. And for the first time, she felt something different, gratitude. Gratitude that he'd made it out whole, that he'd found a clean love, that he hadn't let pain destroy who he was. And feeling this, she cried. She cried in silence, without an audience, without witnesses. Because it was there, in that very moment, that she understood that the true love she'd lost wasn't the one he felt for her. It was the one she'd never known how to feel for herself. That same night, she wrote a final letter. Not to send, but to close. She wrote about everything she'd experienced, about the wrong choices, about how much she regretted them. She said she didn't expect anything more, that she knew he was happy, that he'd found someone who treated him the way he always deserved. She said she wished, from the bottom of her soul, that he'd never again have to wonder if he was enough. That he was now whole. And that she was finally ready to begin the most painful process of all, rebuilding herself. Not to win anyone back, but to recognize herself in the mirror again. She folded the letter, placed it inside a book he'd left behind, and put it on the shelf, as if closing a cycle with the respect it deserves. He, on the other hand, was at home reading that same night. He received a message from her with a simple, "Thank you." Nothing more. He read it, considered replying, but decided to just file it away. Not out of indifference, but because he understood that "thank you" was more than a request for forgiveness. It was an acceptance. It was an end without hard feelings. And for the first time since everything, he was able to sleep soundly, without any weight. Because the story that united them had finally been brought to a close with the truth. And even though the pain still lingered, it no longer had control over him. Now, everything was heading towards a turning point. A necessary conclusion. Life went on, but the impact of the story continued to reverberate within them both. Because some loves don't end. They simply become lessons that shape us forever. And while she tried, day after day, to regain her sense of worth, he continued to learn that true love begins within, and that no one could steal that from him. Not even the one he once loved most. Spring arrived, bringing a more vibrant city, as if the world outside had decided to blossom without asking permission, while inside, everything was still a devastated field. It had been a long time since they had spoken, but his image remained. Not because she insisted on reliving memories, but because his presence had become an inseparable part of who she had been, and losing that was like walking with half of herself. She no longer tried to look for him. She had finally understood that his absence was not a temporary choice. It was a new state of life. The new woman by his side was no longer just a figure who appeared on distant occasions, she was already part of the routine, the habits, the social circles that had once belonged to her. And, more than that, she was the new emotional home of this man she had once considered a safe haven and treated as a way station. But accepting this was not a linear process. It was slow, with relapses, like all pain that teaches. One day, after leaving work, she decided to wander into a bookstore aimlessly. She needed to distract herself, to occupy her eyes and thoughts. She ran her fingers through the books as if searching for answers in their spines. And then, without planning, she came across an old book he had recommended to her years before. It was a special edition, with a cloth cover and pages yellowed with age. When she opened it, on the back cover, she saw something that nearly made her fall to the floor, a note taped there, written by him in his confident, delicate handwriting. The note was signed with the date from when they were still together, and it read, "If this book ever falls into your hands again, perhaps it's fate trying to tell you that certain stories only end when we understand their meaning." She stood there for minutes, still, the book in her hands, her heart racing, her eyes fixed on those words. Was it a memory? A sign? A cruel coincidence? He didn't know. But what he felt was a whirlwind of memories washing over her like violent waves. She took the book home, not for the story, but because she needed to feel once again that, at some point, even if distant, she had been the center of a love that wrote notes hidden in forgotten books. In the days that followed, she began to mentally revisit the most genuine moments between them. Not the dramatic ones, nor the final ones. But the everyday ones. The way he always tucked her in when she fell asleep on the couch. The way he stopped what he was doing to listen to even the most banal stories she told. How he made her tea with the exact honey she liked, how he sometimes looked at her silently, as if simply thanking her for having her there. And then, as if being punished by her own mind, she began to see all of this contrasted with her own actions. The disregard she felt for these gestures, the impatience, the disregard disguised as routine, the days she betrayed him emotionally before even physically betraying him. She felt dirty. As if all the affection he had dedicated to her had been thrown onto a dusty floor, trampled underfoot without her noticing. And that was when she understood, the mistake wasn't just the betrayal. It was failing to see it. While she was immersed in this sea of belated regret, he was experiencing a different phase. He moved in with his new partner, in a smaller but cozy apartment. They shared the chores, the silences, the projects. She listened to him with sincere interest, appreciated the day's small achievements, and touched his hand frequently, as if needing to remind him he was there. But, now and then, he still carried a remnant of the past. Not of longing, but of caution. Sometimes, when he was loved so devotedly, a silent insecurity arose, a doubt as to whether that affection was real or just an illusion about to crumble. The old pain, though healed, left scars that appeared on cloudy days. But the new woman, sensitive to what he didn't say, always offered understanding without demands. And it was this understanding that slowly healed him. Because now, finally, he felt in a space where he didn't have to prove himself enough. And that was liberating. One rainy weekend, something unexpected happened. He was invited to speak at an event about relationships and emotional health, something he'd never considered doing, but had accepted at the urging of a friend who knew his story. The idea was to talk about rebuilding, self-esteem, and the journey after loss. When he took the stage, nervous, he wasn't sure exactly what he would say. But the words came. He spoke, firmly and calmly, about what it's like to give yourself completely to someone and be left behind. About the grief of being in a relationship where you're no longer seen. And about the power of rising even after your heart is broken. He didn't mention names or personal details, but each sentence seemed to be ripped from a real, raw place. At the end of the talk, he received a standing ovation. Many approached him, moved, saying that his words had transformed something within them. What he didn't know was that she was there. Sitting in the last few seats, hidden under a dark coat, her face silent, her eyes filled with suppressed tears. She hadn't come to meet him, she didn't know he would be the speaker. She was taken by a friend who insisted she accompany her, saying the topic could help her understand herself. Listening to him, she felt neither anger nor shame. She felt, above all, pride. Because there, before an unknown audience, was the man she had destroyed and who was now inspiring others to rebuild. He had achieved something she still sought, peace. And in that moment, she knew she no longer needed to speak to him, nor ask for forgiveness again. He had already moved on. And she finally accepted that the love she had destroyed was no longer a place to return. Back to her routine, she began making small but significant changes. She started waking up earlier, started running in the park again, read all the books she'd accumulated over the years, and found a new therapist. She wasn't looking for quick answers or emotional miracles. She knew what she carried was a debt to her own conscience. But she also knew that, even after losing the love of her life, it was still possible to rebuild herself. And that, in itself, was a path. The pain didn't disappear, but it changed form. Now she was quieter, less angry. It was like a scar, visible, sensitive, but healed. In his new relationship, he lived peacefully. Not perfectly, not without challenges. But truly. He finally felt whole. Not because he was with someone new, but because he had relearned to respect himself. And on the days he looked back, he did so with compassion. He didn't hate the woman she was. He understood that they had both lost their way. That love doesn't die suddenly, but is extinguished by 1,000 distractions. And that, often, people cheat not out of malice, but out of immaturity, insecurity, weakness. Still, he knew that what she did had consequences, and the greatest of them was losing him. Both were now walking in opposite, yet parallel, directions. She, learning to love herself after having loved so badly. He, cultivating a serene love that allowed him to continue without fear. And at this point in the story, when everything seemed to have been said, something was still to happen. Something that wouldn't change the course of their lives, but that would bring final closure. Not a reunion, not a reconciliation, but a final exchange of glances. A moment in which everything they had experienced would condense into silence. And after that, each would finally move on, with no trace left of what could not be. Almost 2 years had passed since that rainy afternoon when she, hidden in the back of the auditorium, silently watched the speech of the man who had once been the center of her life. 2 years in which each passing season was both a reminder and a chance for rebuilding. She didn't love him as before, because there was no longer him to love. But she came to love what he represented. His love became a mirror, and only after losing him did she realize how much she needed to find her own reflection in its entirety. The woman who now woke up early, who walked the streets with firm steps, was no longer the same woman who had once hidden behind lies and excuses. But there were still holes inside her that neither time nor regret could fill. It was as if she had learned to live with a silent pain, a wound that no longer bled but would never completely heal. The certainty that she had destroyed something pure, that she had been abandoned not for lack of love but for exhaustion, was the weight she would carry in every gesture of affection from then on. There was no anger, no hope. There was only awareness, and that was the greatest sentence. On an autumn Saturday morning, she walked through the neighborhood where, years before, they had lived together. The cafes had changed, the storefronts were renovated, but the sidewalk still seemed to bear invisible marks from the steps they had walked side by side. She stopped in front of the old building where they lived, unintentionally, simply moved by an almost involuntary impulse. She stood there for several minutes. A new resident entered, holding grocery bags, and she smiled, remembering the times he would wait for her at the door with a smile and a cheap bottle of wine in his hands. In that moment, she understood that, no matter how much life goes on, certain memories have a fixed address. He kept walking until he came across something unexpected. In the window of a small gallery, he saw a photography exhibition. Amidst the landscapes and portraits, she recognized an image that made her stop. It was an old photo, taken by him, of a cafe they used to frequent. The light streamed through the glass window and illuminated the table where they used to sit. She knew instantly that the image was of him. It was his gaze there. The way he captured silence, longing, and presence in a single click. She read the artist's name in the bottom corner. It was him. And in that moment, something inside her broke again. Not with pain, but with acceptance. He had transformed grief into art. Pain into expression. While she was still learning to cope with the past, he had chosen to immortalize it in a beautiful, dignified, serene way. And she respected that deeply. He, however, now lived a life without fanfare, yet full. His current relationship wasn't made of grandiose promises, but of simple truths. There was no comparison, no shadow. He had started over with someone who didn't need healing or convincing. Someone who arrived slowly and stayed with constancy. The trust, once torn, was restored with small gestures, with the mutual respect built daily. He learned to express his feelings, learned to set boundaries, learned that losing yourself to love isn't romanticism, it's self-abandonment. And now, more than loving, he respected himself. On a random Sunday, alongside his new partner, he was organizing photographs for a new exhibition. He found some old ones, images he'd kept in separate folders, with forgotten dates and locations. In one of them, he and his ex-wife were embracing, smiling before an old window. He stared at the image for long seconds, without resentment. He smiled lightly, put the photo back in the box, and closed it. He didn't throw it away. Just left her there, in the past, where she belonged. On a late spring afternoon, the two crossed paths one last time. By chance. At a new, recently opened cafe, where they both, unknowingly, had different appointments. He walked in with his partner, who immediately headed to the counter. She was sitting near the window, fiddling with her phone, and when she looked up, she froze for a second. Their eyes met. There was no surprise. There was no discomfort. Just a silent recognition. He approached out of respect, and she stood out of politeness. The hug was brief. The words, even shorter. They asked each other how they were. She complimented his presentation, he thanked her kindly. When his partner returned, she extended her hand with a discreet smile. The new woman, without jealousy, shook his hand naturally. There was maturity there. There was closure. When he said goodbye, she sat back down, but her eyes remained fixed on the exit. Not out of longing. But because she finally understood that this was the last time. The last exchange of glances, the last chance the universe offered for everything to end with dignity. That night, she arrived home, lit a candle, and sat down in front of the notebook where she'd been writing ever since it all ended. On the last blank page, she calmly wrote, "He loved me like no one ever has. And I needed to lose him to understand that that kind of love doesn't come back. But now, I know who I am. And who I was. And even with all the pain, I'm proud to have lived that love. Even if it was bad. Even if it was late." She closed the notebook, put it in the bottom drawer, and in that silent gesture, put an end to the story. Not a point of oblivion. But of liberation. And so this story ends. A story where there was no forgiveness for a new beginning, but there was forgiveness for liberation. A story where love was profound, but not enough to sustain wrong choices. A story where betrayal destroyed everything sacred, but where pain opened space for the rebirth of those who survived the abyss. May this story serve as a warning. Betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships, it shatters trust, erodes homes, and silently kills affection. No one emerges unscathed. And often, those who betray don't realize that what they lose can never be recovered. This channel does not condone any kind of betrayal. Our purpose is to show, through fictional but intensely real stories, the high price paid for impulsive choices, for selfishness disguised as freedom, for desire disguised as need. If you've made it this far, please comment on what you thought of this story. We want to hear your opinion. Do you think she deserved a second chance? Or that he did the right thing by moving on? Leave your comment and subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and continue following stories as moving as this one. And never forget, those who love, care. Those who care, respect. And those who betray, lose. Because love can forgive. But trust, once broken, is rarely rebuilt. Until the next story.